So I want to thank Tom and Randall Gabriellen for inviting me here to speak with you today. It's really been a pleasure to work with them. They're just marvelous, made all of this quite easy. The Straus family that I'm talking about is the family that owned Macy's for almost 100 years. And it's also the family of Isidore and Ida Straus, who went down together in the Titanic disaster. Most everybody knows that story. But it's not the family of Levi Strauss, the man credited with inventing jeans. He's from a different Straus family. And I am not a family member, although I know more about them than they do. Tom and Randall asked me to speak to you today about the Middletown farms of Percy and Herbert Straus. I've been their historian for more than 30 years, and I could keep you here for days, probably weeks, maybe even months. But I'm going to try to confine my comments to the most interesting stories and hope that you won't fall asleep during this talk. I'm going to start with an overview of the history of the family, and then I'll focus on Percy and Herbert and their presence here in Middletown. The Straus family originated in Georgia, in the southwestern part, in the Rhine Falls. They were a prosperous family, educated people. They spoke French and German and Hebrew. And the reason they spoke French is because this piece of the world was passed back and forth between one country and another, depending on the political situation. They owned land that was cultivated for crops. So what drove Lazarus to come to America? He raised money to support the failed revolution of 1848, but he didn't participate in it. That was an effort by Napoleon to regulate and to tax the Jewish people. Lazarus learned he was going to be called before the courts to explain his actions. And after the revolution, there were hard economic times. To avoid an impending bankruptcy and from being called before the courts, he decided to emigrate. In 1852, Lazarus took a ship from Le Havre to Philadelphia, which was the center of German Jewish immigration. And he was advised that there'd be better opportunities for him in the South, because the Germans had been immigrating for quite a long time and were very well established there. So he went to Western Georgia to begin a new life in America. At the age of 43, he spoke no English, and he was an observant Jew. Now, he may have known the Kaufman brothers. Their family was from a neighboring town, Grünweiler, which was right near Otterburg, where the Strausses lived. They had all come in 1851, and they'd set up a dry goods business in Oglethorpe, which was right near where Lazarus settled. And they supplied him with a push cart. Now, we have this mock-up of a push cart that you can see in the slide on the right. This is a reproduction made by a man who lives in the South and is an historian there. We New Yorkers, people from the Northeast, think of a push cart peddler in a relatively negative term. We think of the Jews of the Lower East Side. But in the South, there were few cities, fewer towns, and almost no stores. And so the peddler would go from widespread plantation to plantation and take orders from the people who lived there. And then he would go north and fill those orders. And when he came back, he would stop at the homes and deliver the goods, usually bring a few trinkets for the wife or the children, but he would also bring gossip and news from one plantation to the next. And so he provided a very welcome service. In 1854, he felt sufficiently successful to settle down, and he leased half a store from a Captain Curley, a tailor, and he opened a dry goods store in a little town called Talbotton. Now, here we have Lazarus and Sarah. Sarah had suffered a stroke about 2 years before the family emigrated and was left partially paralyzed. You can see how she's holding her arm on her lap there. That's because that arm really never worked well after the stroke. So I find it even more amazing that she was able to make a journey in 1854 with 4 very young children, with only the help of one young girl. And so here we have the children. We have Isidore, who was born in 1845, Hermione, the only girl, born in 1846, Nathan, born in 1848, and Oscar in 1850. And this photograph was taken while the family were living in Talbotton. Now, I'm showing you the first house that the Strausses lived in Talbotton. To me, it looked like a shack, but they seemed to like it. And I want you to keep this image in mind when I show you their homes in Middletown Farms. You'll see an amazing contrast. By 1865, the family had already moved to a larger city of Columbus, which is right on the border, the western border of the state. At the end of the Civil War, after the burning of Columbus, Lazarus and his family moved north. And he used the time until he could figure out what to do next by visiting his suppliers and paying off the debts he had from before the war. The only money he had was from selling off at a considerable loss the cotton that he'd stored during the war. And he stated that even if he had nothing else, he wanted to leave his children a good name. One of his creditors, a Mr. Caldwell, was so impressed with Lazarus's integrity. This was the first penny that he'd received from his antebellum suppliers, that he'd offered to sell Lazarus his building. And he told Lazarus that he wouldn't get rich, but that he could make a good living. So Lazarus bought the business for $6,000, and in the first year earned $60,000, a feat that Straus's chalked up to hard work and frugality. The lease, sorry about that. The lease was signed in May of 1866, and L. Straus and Son was formed. Lazarus and his oldest son Isidore were partners, and they were importers of crockery, china, glassware, and manufacturers of lamps. And Nathan, the second son, joined the family business after he completed high school in New York. Nathan became friendly with a man called Roland Hussey Macy, the owner of a dry goods store in New York City, located on 14th Street and 6th Avenue, which was the center of commerce at the time. And here we have a picture of that original store. In 1874, the Strauses opened a 25 by 100-foot concession in the basement, and they sold their merchandise there. It soon became the most popular department in the store. In the first year alone, it accounted for 60% of the store's sales. And for the first time, two different types of merchandise, dry goods and home furnishings, were sold under one roof. And it's under this distinction that Macy's claimed to be the first and original department store. Roland Hussey Macy died in 1877 on a business trip to Paris. Nathan happened to be with him at the time. And Macy heirs were unable to take over the running of the store. So after a succession of partners, in 1888, the Strauses became partners in Macy's, and by 1894, they were sole owners. They continued to expand L. Straus and Sons, and in 1893 also became partners in Abraham and Wexler, changing the name to Abraham and Straus, a Brooklyn department store. And by 1902, it was clear that Macy's had no more room to expand. They had become so big that they needed a different spot. Isidore and Nathan began quietly buying up property on 34th Street at Herald Square. At the time, this was far north of the center of commerce, but they had a vision, and they knew there was going to be an uptown expansion of the subway line, and that the 34th Street bus was going to start running. They felt that it was a good time to move, and Isidore sent his oldest son, Jesse, who had already graduated from Harvard, to help in the planning of the business. Now, this is an interesting story. You can see this is the Macy's building from about 1902. And you can see that there's a little notch in the building with a store on the bottom called Cubanola. The man who owned that property held out. He had heard that the Strauses were buying up property, and he thought that maybe he could make a killing, that he could get a really big amount of money if he held out. And the Strauses just said, we're just not going to be held up for ransom that way. And so they didn't buy that notch. And to this day, they still do not own that piece of land. Today, I believe there's a sunglass hut on the corner of 34th Street and Herald Square. Now, they do own the air rights above. So if you go to Macy's, you'll see a giant red shopping bag with a white star on it. In November 8th, 1902, the Herald Square store opened. And once Percy and Herbert, Isidore's other sons, completed their education at Harvard, they also entered the family business. And in each case, they started at the bottom and worked their way up so they could learn every aspect of the business. And at that time, sons were expected to follow in their father's footsteps and join the family businesses. And several family members have expressed to me that they wish it hadn't been so. They'd wanted to pursue other careers, but they felt they had no option. And as you will learn, it may have been the case for both Percy and Herbert, although we can't know that for certain. As you all know, Macy's really prospered. One can hardly go anywhere in the United States without finding a branch of the store. Today, there are more than 800 branches of Macy's around the country. The Strausses continued to own it until a very bitter leveraged buyout in 1986. And I really wish I had time to tell you more about some of these other Strausses because they're truly an amazing family. But for the rest of the talk, I'm going to confine myself to the history of Percy and Herbert and their families, and then later as it relates to Middletown. Isidore married Ida Blunn in July 12, 1871. Her family came from Worms in Germany, and it's likely also that the families knew each other in Germany. Isidore and Ida had 7 children, 6 of whom survived. They had Jesse Isidore, Percy Solomon, who later changed his name to Percy Selden, Sarah, Minnie, Herbert Nathan, and Vivian. In the early 1900s, women didn't generally enter the workforce, so only Jesse, Percy, and Herbert became executives in the family businesses, Macy's, L. Straus and Sons, and Abraham and Straus. Now, we don't have many pictures of Percy and Herbert in the individual pictures, and so I'm going to quickly show you a series of family pictures that you'll see them in these pictures. So this is the family in 1889. Percy is standing with a hat on and holding a tennis racket, and he was 13 in this photo, and Herbert was seated. He was 8. Now, this photo was taken on Isidore and Ida's 25th wedding anniversary, July 12, 1896. And at the time, Percy was 20 and Herbert was 15. Isidore and Ida, like many affluent New York couples, had a summer home at Elberon, which is pictured here. Now, remember the shack I showed you in Talbotton? This is not that many years later, about 50 years later, and this is a remarkable change. And here we have the family in 1905 in Elberon, and you can see Percy and Edith on the far left, and behind them are Herbert and Therese. And this was just shortly before Herbert and Percy bought their homes. Now, here's Percy as a mature person. He was born in New York City in 1876. When he was about 14, he changed his name from Percy Solomon Straus to Percy Selden Straus, and he was known as Percy Selden for the remainder of his life. And he was the second son of Isidore and Ida. In 1902, he graduated from Harvard, and he married Edith Abraham. She was the daughter of the Strausses' business partner in Abraham and Straus. When Percy graduated from Harvard, he had a keen desire to be an educator, but his destiny was to follow in his father's footsteps, and he became one of the first to use education as an integral part of the functioning of modern business. He pioneered the scientific placement of personnel, using psychological examinations as a basis for establishing fitness for positions. In 1912, when Isidore and Ida drowned in the Titanic disaster, their 3 sons, Jesse, Percy, and Herbert, were already in executive positions at Macy's, and they were fully able to continue the store's meteoric growth. In 1919, the family business was changed from a partnership to a corporation, and Percy became its vice president. In 1932, when his older brother Jesse became ambassador to France, Percy succeeded as the president of Macy's. But following a heart attack in 1939, he stepped down and was named chairman of the board of Macy & Company. Percy's credited with the tremendous latter-day development of the mercantile establishment. He had many outside interests, but I'm going to mention just a few. He was the founder and director of the American Retail Federation. And through this organization, he tried to interest graduates and higher educational institutions in merchandising opportunities. One of the charities which he was proudest of was Camp Isida, named for his father and mother, which he established for the employees of the firm. He was one of the founders of the New York University Institute of Fine Arts and donated $1 million to NYU in 1929 as an unrestricted endowment. He and his brothers donated $300,000 to Harvard for the erection of Straus Hall, a freshman dormitory, so named in memory of their father. And they donated $75,000 to endow a professorship in the Harvard Graduate School of Business Education. Straus Hall is still used as a freshman dorm today, and Max Bazerman is the current Jesse Isidore Straus Professor of Business Administration at Harvard. Percy is one of a small group of men responsible for conceiving and making possible the 1939 and 1940 World's Fair. The list of his involvements in politics, public service and community affairs is quite long. Oops, I don't know why I'm doing that tonight. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, wealthy New Yorkers spent weekends and summers on the Jersey Shore. A New York Times article from August 23, 1908, reported that Percy S. Straus and Herbert M. Straus purchased large tracts on the Middletown side of the Shrewsbury River and will shortly begin erection of country seats. Herbert's tract embraced the palmy property of 30 acres. Percy's property was on the southwest corner and Herbert's was on the northwest corner. Now, it was reported elsewhere that Herbert and his wife, Therese Kuhn Straus, made an initial purchase of 70 acres, but later they must have bought additional acreage because each of them had 100 acres when their farm. Percy was a great enthusiast of horseback riding and swimming, and he never missed a weekend of horseback riding until his heart attack in 1939. He had polo ponies that were stabled on the grounds of his property, and Herbert also kept his horses in Percy's stables and continued to do so until that property was sold in 1929 to J. Wright Brown. Percy was a great collector of Italian Renaissance art, and on May 15, 1924, their house, a brick home, was burned during renovation. Their loss was expected to reach several $100,000, as many valuable paintings, rugs, and art objects that were brought from Europe were consumed by the fire. They were disgusted with the manner in which the fire workers destroyed their property, ripping up plantings as they gathered to watch the fire. Rather than rebuild, Percy and Edith decided to relocate to Port Chester in Westchester County. And here we have a picture of their home, which they called Hill Home. In his 60th birthday celebration included an Olympic swimmer in their oval pool, which you can see on the right. That's their property in Suffolk, in Westchester County. His well-stocked stables always contained horses that he rode on King Street with Bernard Gimble, Herbert Lehman, and Alfred Knopf were also neighbors and rode with him. Percy died in 1944 in New York City at the age of 68. And after his death, Edith donated Hill Home to High Point Hospital. It was used to rehabilitate wounded soldiers who suffered during World War II. Edith, who had multiple sclerosis, was quite handicapped for a very long time. And after Percy's death, she remained bedridden in her New York City apartment. She died in 1957 at the age of 75. Unfortunately, we know of no photographs of Percy and Edith's house or the outbuildings in Middletown. But there's much more information about Herbert and Therese's Middletown farm, which I visited. And we have many, many photographs of the property and the buildings, which I will show you now. By the way, the family referred to Herbert and Therese's property as Tower Hill Farm, although we continue to call it Middletown Farm. So Herbert Nathan, we're going to switch now to him, was born in 1881, and he was the third surviving son of Isidore and Ida. And here we have a picture of the children of Isidore and Ida from about 1899, and Herbert was 18 in this photo. Now, he also attended Harvard like his brothers, and he was expected to enter the family business. By then, his older brothers were well established at Macy's, and he had to work his way up to an executive position. In 1907, he married Therese Kuhn, who was from a prominent Cincinnati family. She studied art history in New York City and was a Francophile. Her family described her as serious, not a warm person, who they referred to as the Duchess because of her lifestyle. In her later years, even though she was living alone, she still had a maid, a cook, a laundress, a butler, and a chauffeur, giving up the chauffeur only after her sons insisted she no longer keep it because she wasn't using her limo and driver. And as I've mentioned, the Straus brothers formed a partnership after the death of their father in 1912 and incorporated in 1919. Herbert, who was 5.5 years younger than Percy, became vice president and treasurer. In 1929, Macy's acquired Bamberger's, a New Jersey department store. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And in May 1930, Herbert became its president, succeeding Percy, who resigned because of his health. Herbert was also the director of other department stores that the Strauses had acquired, including Davis and Paxton in Atlanta and LaSalle and Catch in Toledo, Ohio. and he was also a director of the Fidelity Union Trust Company in Newark. Besides being a merchant, Herbert was a patron of the arts and a servant of his country, a prominent figure in the Republican Party affairs and a philanthropist. In 1928, he gave the Metropolitan Museum of Art 5 volumes of engravings of the works of Watteau, a rarity which is thought no other American museum possesses to this day. At Harvard, Herbert played the violin and cello solos in the music club. At his home, he organized a Stradivarius quartet in which he played a Davidoff Stradivarius violin. When he died, he had 7 violins and 4 of them were Stradivarii. He also had a Guadagnini violin, which he willed to a friend after his death. His home was decorated with many choice works of art and engravings. Herbert died in, I am not good with this today. Herbert died at his home at 1144 Park Avenue in New York, April 6, 1933. He was 51 years old. He and his brothers and their families are all interred in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Straus Mausoleum. This is a lovely complex. You can see in the front, there is a picture of a galley. It's a replica of an Egyptian funeral galley. And inside on the ground, Isidore's body is buried. Ida's body was never recovered. But on the inside wall of this beautiful, lovely sculpture is an inscription that says, "Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it." Now, there are 3 buildings to this complex. You can't see the third one. The one you can see on the left is for Jesse and his family. And the one you see on the right is for Herbert and his family. And there's a third building all the way to the left that's for Percy and his building. And these buildings are still being used today. And in fact, at the back of these buildings, there are lovely Tiffany windows. So it's really a treat to go visit this place. As I've told you, we have no images of Percy and Edith's home. Once they moved to Portchester in 1924, their active social life revolved around Hillholm and their fabulous estate. Edith loved to garden and frequently participated in flower shows. Percy rode his horses whenever possible, and they entertained around their lovely oval swimming pool, holding lavish parties with politicians, movie stars, and fellow merchants in attendance. Once Edith's MS began to be obvious, she was unable to keep up with their busy social schedule, and their activities were drastically curtailed. But one can only imagine that their lifestyle was similar during the time they spent in Middletown. So now you know a little bit about the men and who once owned fantastic estates. And we know more about Percy and Herbert's time in Middletown and about their beautiful estate. In 1929, architect Alfred Hopkins was the country's foremost architect of farm groups, banks, and prisons, and he was hired by Herbert and Therese to build the new stable, garden, garage, butler, stableman, and gardener's house, and the dairy complex. Randall Gabriellan from your group knows far more about than architecture, and he sent me the following information about Hopkins, and graciously permits me to quote it here. Alfred Hopkins, born in 1870 in Saratoga Springs, New York, studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, Paris, and in Rome. He had two design specialties, farm groups and prisons. In brief, a farm group is an architectural component of a rich person's country estate that included farm buildings that would usually include a carriage house, a stable, a dairy, a farmer's or superintendent's house, and specifically buildings to support the client's individual interests, such as a chicken house. The buildings were usually part of a single tract of land, although the Herbert Nathan Straus operation, separated by Cooper Road, appears to be 2 separate farms. Hopkins, who had long desired to build his own place, found a spot to his pleasing in Princeton and designed a house there around the early 1900s. The house bears design components distinctly reminiscent to Cobble Close. Hopkins died in Princeton in 1941. Now here we have, I am sorry, this is a very, very tender, sensitive. Here we have a survey of the property that the Strauses earned. But this was later after pieces of it had been sold off. But you can see the stable, the garage, and the tower are depicted here. And here's one more image of, this is Cooper Road. You can see the main residence is listed. And this, across the street, the dairy and the barns. It's believed that Herbert and Therese would build a French Norman chateau to replace the wooden frame main house that came with the property when Herbert and Therese bought it. Construction of the chateau was scheduled to begin following completion of the other farm groups. And in preparation for this particular construction, the lawn was terraced and stone pillars led up to what appears to be the site of the planned construction. Sometime between 1908 and 1929, the Strauses had renovated the white wood frame house, and they continued to live in it while their other construction projects were underway. Now here we have a picture of Herbert, Jesse, and Percy, and this was taken in 1920. And although only a small part of the house is shown, it appears that the photo was taken in front of Herbert's house at Middletown Farm. Randall Gabrielin called Middletown Farm among the country's most artistic landmarks. When the Strauses began their ambitious building projects, Herbert was vice president of Macy's, president of the recently purchased Bambergers in New Jersey, and he planned his signature home at a time when there was increasing profitability in the family businesses. In 1929 alone, Macy's had a profit of $100 million. Once the stock market crashed later in the year, the plans for their building projects in their country estate were all well underway. The Strauses historically didn't invest in the stock market. They bought land and businesses. And so although their sales suffered because of the stock market crash, they didn't have the astronomical, catastrophic losses suffered by so many others. Therese justified continuing her building and landscaping projects in the face of criticism by explaining that she was providing employment to so many workers who would otherwise be on the breadlines. During the same period, they were also completely renovating a New York City townhouse at 9 East 71st Street that was designed by Horace Trombauer of Philadelphia, and I will show you something of that later. Herbert died in 1933. Teresa kept the Middletown farm until 1949, when it was sold at auction for a total of $116,150. Since there was no single buyer for the entire estate, it was broken up into 5 separate parcels, which were bought by 4 individuals, one person buying 2 parcels. The buyers were James McConnell of Jersey City, Samuel T. French of Camden, Herbert C. Sallee of Hackensack, who bought 2 parcels, and Albert G. Dorset of Montclair. Therese insisted on a clause in the offering stating that she would have a 90-day cancellation provision. She wanted to be certain she approved of the new buyers. The caretaker's house was on 2.9-acre lot, and it brought in more than any other parcel, even though all the others were much larger. In 1910, Ned Brown, who lived in one of the dependencies, the butler's house on the estate grounds, invited the descendants of Herbert and Therese for a tour of the estate. He described the plan of the day. All 4 parcels of the original farm will be available for viewing. We will start at the top at the stable, gardeners, chauffeurs, and butlers' houses. Move a few hundred yards to the main house, down the long drive and over the original stone bridge to the superintendent's house. Then across the road to the cow barn complex and the formal garden behind. We were amazed that many of the neighboring estates, including the adjoining former 100-acre estate of Percy and Edith, were sold off. This one, although now privately owned in parcels by different owners, still looked at must-have when the Strauses lived there. Sally Strong Straus was the widow of Herbert's son, Oliver, and she allowed me to photocopy and scan many of Oliver's papers and photographs, and among those were photographs and images of the construction projects taken in Middletown Farm. The black and white photos you'll be seeing and comparing with the more modern photos were taken January 2nd, 1930. One of Herbert and Therese's grandsons told me that they had to extend the railroad line during the construction project in order to bring in the materials for it. So when we arrived, we drove through stone pillars to get to the butler's house, the former stables, and the garage complex. It was like being transported to another time. The French Norman style buildings are largely intact, and the landscaping seems to have been well preserved. In 1949, James McConnell bought the upper level, which includes the stable, garage, caretaker, gardener, and butler complex. But James' son and his wife, Kathy, lived in the gardener's house until about 25 years ago. And then the Strauses owned it. It was the responsibility of the gardener to house the visiting chauffeurs. And so that house has 5 bedrooms. Today, Bud and Kathy, active preservationists, live in the former 13-stall stable that they've converted into lovely space. And you can see that on the right. The charm and character of the building was preserved during the reconstruction. The stone floor is the original, as is the wood ceiling and beams. Bud and Kathy tongue and oiled the ceiling and mounted modern high-at lighting without taking away any of the original feel of the room. The former tack room is Bud's dressing room, with a room above it where the hay was once stored for the horses. The original stables had 2 guest bedrooms for visiting grooms, and Bud and Kathy have made creative use of all the space in this lovely house without destroying any of the building's original features or charm. The 9-car garage, with its clock tower above, adjoins the stable at right angles. When Bud's family first came to the place, there was a Duesenberg in the garage that once belonged to the Strauses. John Straus, who is one of the sons of Herbert and Therese, would drive this to the railroad station when he had to go to work in the morning. He said that Bud said that the garage was meticulously clean, and it's where Bud still houses his 1939 Cadillac, the car he used when he learned to drive. He told us that all his daughters were married in this garage, and so you can imagine how wonderful the space was and remains. Bud's tour of his property included showing us the impressive garage doors with their bas-relief sculptures. There are carvings of Herbert and his Irish setter, Therese and the architect, workmen building the complex, and many other scenes. And Bud believes the wood is French oak and that the doors were carved in England. Ned lived in one of the dependencies, the butler's cottage. He commented that it contained 3 bedrooms, a small formal dining room, study, and a china closet, just as a proper butler should require. Also in this upper complex is the stableman's house, and here you see 2 images at different seasons. The caretaker's house is also located in the upper complex, as is a round, vine-covered building with a conical roof that was designed to be Therese's personal study, but she never used it. She told Bud's father that it was the only lemon on the place because it had a couple of cracks and the floor was bad. The ground floor was used as a tool room for gardening equipment, and Bud and Kathy converted it into a kitchen and a dressing room for the pool. Now here's another view, a modern day view. This was from 1910 when we visited, of the proposed study and the butler's house. The wooden frame house of Herbert and Therese was the next stop on our tour. The house was bought in 2003 by a private individual as an investment and then put on the market shortly thereafter. But it didn't sell by 2019 and was being kept occupied by renters. We couldn't enter the house, but we were able to tour the grounds, and we saw the terrace gardens leading up to what is believed to have been the proposed location of the Strauss' French Norman style chateau. Martha Brooks Hutchison, one of the first female landscape architects, designed the gardens. From the front lawn, one gets a spectacular panoramic view of the rolling hills of this lovely estate. This house is said to be on the second highest point on the East Coast before the Palisades. And I've been told by Jeff Minden, who lives at Cobble Close, that the house was torn down. But I don't know if there's a new house there at this time. After Herbert died, Therese decided not to build her Norman chateau, and she gave full rooms of furniture to the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. She was a Francophile, and everything had to be perfect. She also gave furniture from her 9 East 71st Street house to the Met. And here you can see a room on the left from the Cour d'Albret in Bordeaux. The carvings are attributed to Barthélemy Cabriot, 1732 to 1780, and his studio. And the other room is the Grand Salon from the Hotel de Tesse in Paris. The woodwork was created between 1768 and 1772 by Nicolas Hillot. And here's 2 views from the back and the side of the house. After enjoying the grounds and the view from the lawn in front of the main house, we proceeded down the driveway toward Meadow Cottage. This long sloping road used to be lined with rhododendrons and azaleas and pine trees. Mr. Clemens was the head gardener when the Strauses lived there, and during the summer they employed 9 full-time gardeners. And although it's still lovely, some of those rhododendrons and azaleas are mostly gone, as are most of the pine trees. Throughout the day, family members kept talking about Meadow Cottage, a place that stands out because when she was preparing to sell, Therese gave away the flatware, tablecloths, and linens from Meadow Cottage. Each piece bore her monogram as well as Meadow Cottage on the obverse, and each set of linens was embroidered, had a ribbon color coded for the person receiving it. This cottage is located in the middle complex of the estate, and it was built in 1937, the last house to be built in the complex. When Percy's house burned down, T.W. Head was the superintendent of the estate. Thomas Head later was reported to be the superintendent of Herbert's estate and living in this cottage. The owners in 2010 were Angela and Hendrik Menink, who lovingly restored it and renamed it Griffin House. When we visited, Angela carefully explained the pains she took in faithfully restoring their home, including the fleur-de-lis. Excuse me, so much talking. The fleur-de-lis and rose motif on the ceiling and the mantel's fireplace. She also preserved the thistle design found throughout the cottage, and she told us that the architect lived in France for a year and brought back stone with him when he began this building project. Now we move on to Cobble Close, and here we have an overhead. The cow barn complex, complete with few cows, is located on the lower level, and it was a working farm with a pasteurizer, farm equipment, building, and a 12-room servants' quarter. It was described as a French Norman farm village. Herbert and Therese's son, Edward, remembered the cow barns before the reconstruction in 1929, and he spoke of it as old and decrepit and smelly. The old barns were torn down when the new dairy complex was built. Everyone, when describing this complex, calls it spectacular. I was told Therese put more effort into the cow barns than she did into the other buildings on the estate. And they were built in the Southern French style and included a pond, and a dam on one end of the pond sits below an arcade. You can see the pond on the lower right and the arcade just behind it with some little cutout windows. I'll show you better pictures of that in a little while. This complex is known as Cobble Close because of the series of buildings that form a square and surround a sizable courtyard containing a close. In 1949, Judge John Warren bought the cow complex. He loved living there, but his wife hated it. At the time, he tried to get permits to turn the complex into condos, but was unable to accomplish that. Woody Brown, was looking for property in the area and fell in love with the farm complex. Woody eventually saw an obituary for Judge Warren in the newspapers and came down the next day to ask Warren's widow if she would sell the property to him, and she did. Cobble Close is beautifully restored by Woody Brown and his partner, Fred Century. It has been converted into condo units and a home for Fred. Now, here are 2 views of Fred's house. The one on the left is the entrance to this beautiful house. Fred gave us a tour of Cobble Close and included an explanation of how he converted the former orangery, where the trees and shrubs in huge tubs from around the estate were stored during the winter months. He turned it into a sunken living room, and I think that's really quite magnificent. We walked through the covered arcade and saw the lovely sculptures Therese had installed in the pond and around this cow complex. Oh, lucky cows. So here's a 2015 view of the arcade and a lovely little patio for sitting out. And there are more views of construction of the pond from 1930. And more views of the pond and the arcade. Now I'm going to digress here for a moment. In 1934, Architecture magazine published several pages with images of the Straus Farm Group. And we're lucky to have copies of these pages. And so I'm going to show you the pages here. This is all from 1934. And I can tell you, having seen this in 2010, it really hasn't changed all that much. During our 2010 tour of Middletown Farm, we met Bruce and Marty Huber. Bruce's father owned a large amount of land adjacent to the Straus property in the 1930s, and the family donated much of this land in the 1970s so that it could be preserved as a county park. Bud McConnell, who showed us his lovely home, and I've spoken of him, the former stables in the upper complex, and hosted a luncheon for the Straus descendants, said, the Strauses lived here for 20 years, and the McConnells have been stewards for 50 years, and yet the place is still known as the Straus Estate. I've been blessed to live here most of my life, and the way I view it, I never would have had the opportunity without the vision and dedication to excellence of the Strauses. When Herbert died in 1933, Therese was in the process of renovating a New York City home at 9 East 71st Street, as in the same time that she was doing Middletown Farm. The New York City house was to be a 40-room French Renaissance palace. Therese was a Francophile and insisted on everything being authentic. When Trumbauer, the architect, wanted to build her a center hall stairways that looked exactly like one in a French chateau, he told her no one would know the difference. And she replied, I would know. The Straus's home was meant to reflect taste and elegance and wealth. Entire 18th century rooms were purchased to be shipped and installed in the 6-story limestone mansion. And she never completed this work either and was unable to sell it for many years. She moved into a luxurious apartment, but found that many of the furnishings were too large. And I showed you images of 2 full rooms of furniture that she had donated to the museum. There are more. The house was finally donated to the Roman Catholic Archdiocese, who converted it into a sumptuous 50-bed hospital. In 1961, it was sold to a college prep school, and in 1989, it returned to private hands. A recent donor of this lovely house was the infamous Jeffrey Epstein, whose renovations and over-the-top artistic displays, many of them pornographic, would surely have disgusted the Strauses. The most recent buyer of 9 East 71st Street is a former investment banker from Goldman Sachs, who paid $51 million for it, far less than the $88 million asking price. Although Herbert died in 1933, Therese lived a long life. She died in 1977 in New York City, and her descendants have many stories to tell about this elegant woman who demanded nothing less than her vision of perfection from those around her. The beauty of Middletown Farm Cobble Close has endured in the lovely countryside of New Jersey, and I feel so lucky I was able to visit and to share my photographs and a little bit of Straus history with you. And so as I've come to the end of my talk, I hope most of you are awake and have learned something new and interesting. I write a newsletter for the Straus Historical Society twice a year that's mailed to everyone on our mailing list. And all back issues are posted back to 1993. They're available all on our website. You can find many articles about these people I've spoken about tonight in the newsletters and much, much more. And I'm happy to respond to queries. You can contact me through our website, social media platforms, or directly by email or phone. And so now I'm going to turn the floor back to Tom, and I'd be happy to respond to your questions.
Joan, thank you. That was excellent. Thank you for
Great.
that. If anybody has any questions, please start entering them into the chat, and we do have some time, so Joan will be able to get to them. Joan, actually, I have a question while we wait for some
Sure.
questions to maybe come in.
Sure.
So do you know why, or why do you think the Straus family was not able to sell the entire property as one unit and had to split it up?
I imagine just because it was so large. I mean, I don't know. I have no knowledge at all. My guess would be that it was so large, and because Cobble Close was such a different piece, the farm group was such a different piece than the other groupings, that I would imagine that they couldn't have appealed to one person. It would take a special group. You know, by then income tax had come in. People didn't have the same kind of discretionary wealth. It may have just been that it was just people didn't have the kind of money that the Strausses had in the early days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see. See if any chats are coming in.
No questions.
Yeah, we got a couple questions coming in. Let's see. Just to clarify, Middletown Farm is Cobble Close. Can you just clarify that?
Cobble Close seems to have, maybe Jeff Minden, who's here and lives in Cobble Close, perhaps can clarify a little bit better than I can. My understanding is that when the Strauses owned it, the entire complex was called Middletown Farms. Maybe, but I believe that because it was called the Farm Group, and I think Cobble Close became the name later, maybe when it was broken up in '49. Jeff, I don't know if Jeff Minden can hear me and if he has anything to contribute to that. Jeff is a real estate historian and he lives at Cobble Close, so he may have some information beyond that. I think it was Middletown Farms when the Strauses lived there.
Yeah, Cobble Close denotes just the farm group where the dairy cows were. Prior to 1949, I don't know how it was referred to, but since Woody and Fred bought it in the early 50s, it's just the farm group Cobble Close, where 4 families live there right now.
Okay. And Randall Gabrielle is coming in with, I have long believed that the entire property was known as Middletown Farm.
The Strauses in some of the paperwork call it Tower Hill Farm.
Okay.
Cobble Close is at 310 Cooper Road.
Okay. Anybody have any other questions or anything you want to ask Jeff?
At various times, I know that there have been, some of the houses have been for sale, and we've seen some real estate brochures. And it's always called Cobble Close, but that's always the farm group. It's never any of the upper or middle complex.
Yeah, there have been 4 sales there in the last 55 years, 3 of which occurred when one of the owners passed away. So there's not a lot of turnover there. However, I'll be unfortunately moving after 28 years, so I'm going to put mine on the market probably in June. And I live in what was the cattle barn. My living room was full of cows and it had a trough in it. That's long gone, but yeah, it's owned by 4 people. It's a co-op, in fact, and most of the people who live there, Fred's been there for 65, 70 years. I've been there 28. My next door neighbor's been there 20, and then there was a new family that moved in, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. And from Randall Gabrielle, and he's saying the name Tower Hill Farm seems to come from the view of Tower Hill in Red Bank that could be seen from the house.
Okay.
A question here, were the dairy farms a commercial enterprise? And if so, what products did they sell and under what name?
I have no idea. Maybe Jeff, would you know something about that?
I know they sold milk. I found actually a milk bottle underground once, but in my den was where they milked the cows, and my guest room is where they bottled the milk. But beyond that, I really don't know.
And does anybody know who owned the property before Straus?
I'm sure we could look it up. I don't know, but I'm sure we could look it up because real estate records are public records.
Mm-hmm.
We have only the New York Times article that reports the sale.
It didn't have a label on it. It had indentations, but it was so old and worn, I couldn't see what it said.
That's a response to a bottle that you
About the
found.
milk
Was it labeled?
bottles?
Yeah, the bottle question.
Mm-hmm. So Jeff, what is it like living there?
Oh, it's wonderful. I mean, it's borders on magical because you feel like you're in France. I mean, as we've been discussing, there's nothing remotely like it anywhere that I've seen in the Northeast. And though there are 4 occupants there, each person has a section of the complex. and you rarely see your neighbors. Yet, the nice thing is, they're there if you need a cup of sugar or whatever. But it's a wonderful place.
The complex is 13 acres.
Yes, and
So
architecturally, fundamentally, nothing has changed on the exterior, barring one small addition here and there. And a pool was added in the 1950s in an old workyard. But if you look at the pictures when the complex was completed and you drive through Cobble Close now, the only difference is the vegetation and trees are much larger today.
that was what was so remarkable to me. I have many, many, many more of these January 1930 images of the construction projects. And having been there and taken my own photos in 2010, I found it remarkable how little had changed. That it was easy to recognize the buildings. It was easy to see that where this picture was taken in 1930, because we were standing in that same spot without the scaffolding, without the construction mess. It was fun to see some of the old cars and old trucks. But we have quite a number of those photographs. I should just try to pick some so I wouldn't bore you guys. But it was fantastic to be able to show the difference.
Jeff, you might know the answer to this. Has there been any appetite or any attempts to get it on a state or national register of historic places?
Yeah, we were visited by somebody from, I think, the State Historical Society, and we decided not to register it because the restrictions imposed on us were kind of onerous. But the fact is, nobody who lives there is going to change anything. I mean, we all moved there because we loved the history and the architecture. And I think the Historical Society was worried, somebody might put some gaudy addition on it, but that's never going to happen because you need approval of everybody, and nobody would approve that.
Mm-hmm. Has there been any archaeological digs anywhere you know of?
Not to my knowledge. We're kind of like off the road. Once a fire alarm went off and the fire trucks came down and said they didn't even know the place existed, which was a little scary. But no, we don't get much visitation or inquiries at all, in fact.
Mm-hmm. Another question, is this Straus family related to the Straus family of the historic mansion in Atlantic Highlands?
No.
Yeah, there is no relation
No.
there. And that's a Straus with two S's at the end.
Straus is a very common name, and of course there are many Strauses with two S's at the end, but even Straus with one S, final S, is quite a common name, and there are lots of them. And unfortunately, there are lots of people who would like to be related to the Strauses because of Isidore and Ida's adventure on Titanic. So I get quite a lot of mail, particularly from young people whose family have said, "Oh yes, that was your aunt or uncle, who died on Titanic." But it is, I have 15,600, almost 15,700 people in the database. So I know pretty much most of them. And so it's easy to tell who's a Straus and who is not, who's a Straus in this family.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, to your knowledge, nobody's buried on the property, right?
Not to my knowledge. I haven't found anybody yet.
Okay, great. Joan or Jeff, is there anything else you'd like to say?
I'd just like to say that we've been blessed to have this history so intact and to be able to share it with so many people who are interested in it, and we would like to continue sharing. So we welcome contact from everybody. Please, give us a call, send an email, get on the mailing list, and maybe sometime in the future we'll be able to actually visit. Who knows? It would be nice to go there again and to see this place again. But we'll see what we can do about that.
Yeah, great. All right, Joan, Jeff, thank you so much. This was excellent.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for attending. Once again,
Yep,
for additional info on the Historical Society, visit us at middletownNJhistory.org. We hope to see you again next month. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.